everybody. Today we are debating whether or not we should rip down Confederate statues, and we're starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here for this epic debate. So this is going to be an interesting one, folks. We've never debated this topic before. And want to let you know, by the way, if it's your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button as we have many more debates to come. So, for example, we are very excited as there are a couple of, I'm not exaggerating, folks. We're like, I can't announce them quite yet. We're like on the cusp of it to where I could announce it. And these debates are honestly going to be epic, like ground shaking. One thing I'm noticing, forgive me, folks, I am noticing huge lag. So, what we might have to do, worst case scenario. Oh, okay. I think it's straightening out. Okay. So glad. Basically, what we are going to do is, as I mentioned, ooh, you know what that lag is? It's an icky lag. So let me see if we're going to be okay with this, because if the lag is really bad, we might have to try something. We might have to try changing things up. But so far, it's kind of like, it's right on the cusp. Okay, so let me, folks, introduce who we have on tonight, as this is going to be a lot of fun. First, we have our dearest co-mod, Hunter Bailey. This is going to be a lot of fun, as I'm basically, in a way you could say, getting Hunter back into the swing of things. You guys probably remember Hunter's been on before. He is a fair and neutral moderator, and so kind of just getting him into the swing of things again. We are very excited to have him join us, and he will be hopefully maybe doing 1 or 2 streams a week as a moderator, as we have honestly it's a good problem to have. We have a huge influx of people requesting a debate right now, which is exciting, and it's like, man, we are pumped about all these topics and to have these, and so that's why we just really appreciate Hunter being here to party and help mod. Now, want to let you know, this topic tonight, it's controversial, folks. This ain't your grandma's debate channel, Hunter, okay? It's not. What we're going to debate is whether or not the Confederate statues ought to be torn down. Raging Atheist, who you see on your left, will be arguing yes, and he will be going first with a 10-minute opening statement. Next, CJ Cox, who you see on your right on the screen, will be going with his 10-minute opening statement. And then, immediately after that, we'll go into open conversation. So, just a couple of quick housekeeping things up front. If you have a question for the question and answer at the end, feel free to fire it into the old live chat. And if you tag me with @ModernDayDebate, it makes it easier for me to be sure I get every single question in that list. Super Chat's also an option, and you can ask a question or make a comment with a Super Chat. And also, doing a Super Chat will push your question or comment to the top of the list during the Q&A. So, very exciting, overtly validated. Thanks for your Super Chat, by the way. So we're going to jump into those pretty quick. We're going to maybe try to do some of those Super Chats between sections too, by the way. And then if the studio is flashing red or green, a red flash is basically a new Super Chat, and then green is a new subscriber. So that's why you'll see that, and then you'll see that written out on the screen. So I'm going to kick it over to our dearest friend, Hunter Bailey, to get us rocking and rolling, and he'll kind of get the actual debate going. So again, thanks all 3 of you gentlemen for being here, and Hunter, who is, by the way, from Sentinel Apologetics, the floor is all yours. Hunter.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it. Well, thanks, guys, for coming, and thanks, everybody, for joining us. I'm happy to be back. Definitely will probably be seeing me more on here, so looking forward to it. So what we're going to have is 10-minute openings for each person, for each debater, and then after that, we're going to have an open conversation for about maybe 45 to 60 minutes, depending on how the conversation goes, and then after that, we're going to have the Q&A. So make sure, again, to fill out those Super Chats and send them on in, because they will move right to the front of our list. And then, afterwards, we'll try to get to the regular questions as much as we can, okay? So, Raging Atheist, you are the affirmative, so you're going to go first. And whenever you're ready, once you're done, you can either tell me that you're done, or once the 10 minutes is up, I'll let you know. And then after that, Jay, it'll be your turn. The floor is yours.
Awesome. Thank you. So, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, and to assume the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation, which is what I am doing tonight, right now, declaring that it is time to separate the modern America from the America before, and put the Confederacy in the dustbins of history where it belongs. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These are the founding ideals of our nation, ideals that we still strive toward, but have never fully achieved. We see this today as millions of people pour into the streets with three simple but powerful words: Black Lives Matter. A protest against the white supremacy that has dominated this nation well before this nation itself was ever conceived. And I am here tonight declaring that now is the time to end that legacy of white supremacy. Such a long, vile history that encompasses more than just statues that are up for discussion tonight. The mid-Atlantic slave trade began in the 1400s after the Americas were discovered. There weren't enough settlers to produce the labor-intensive crash crops the Americas supplied in abundance: sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton. Since Europe has long outlawed making Christian slaves, the settlers tried to make Native Americans their slaves. But the natives were dying in staggering numbers as a result of the new diseases brought by the Europeans, and those that weren't dying were able to resist successfully. So Europe turned to Africa, a country that had several slave systems for hundreds of years already. Nothing like the slavery here, mind you, more like indentured servitude. But when the Europeans came offering manufactured goods, weapons, and rum, chieftains were quick to sell their slaves. These Christian settlers needed to justify to themselves the taking and using of human as property. So they invented white supremacy, declaring Black peoples to be less than human, or 3/5 human, according to the 3/5 Compromise of 1787. This compromise made it official policy that Blacks were inferior to whites. Slaves could not vote, so had no say in their place in society. They were forbidden to learn of reading and writing, and they were not allowed to marry outside of their race. Congress outlawed the African slave trade in 1808, but not slavery itself. By 1860, white supremacy was the dominating ideology, as 90% of white Americans thought they were superior to Black peoples. 90%. Also by 1860, and this is a very important number, enslaved Africans were 13% of the total US population. And then came the Civil War, and many will rightfully point out that Lincoln never wanted to end slavery. In 1858, Lincoln said, "I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and Black races." The lost cause narrative would use this quote, and many others like it, to whitewash the history of the war, to not be about slavery at all, but states' rights. But this is just a narrative, propaganda to keep white supremacy alive, and it was very successful. But the truth is, the war was about slavery. Every single state that seceded from the Union listed slavery as its primary reason for leaving the Union. The North won, the South lost, and in 1865, the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal. Reconstruction kept the South under Northern rule. All Confederate statues were taken down, and we saw some strides towards equality for newly emancipated African Americans. But Lincoln's main priority after the war wasn't all the people he had just freed. It was keeping the Union together. So he pardoned all of the Confederates and sent them home. Lincoln would also veto any legislation that would come before him outlawing slavery altogether. Abraham Lincoln allowed white supremacy to live. Reconstruction ends in the mid 1870s, taking with it the Northern soldiers, and reconciliation begins. The South has control of the South again, and those pardoned Confederates begin to take office. But even before that, white supremacy had already risen again. When in 1866, a former Confederate general creates the Ku Klux Klan and begins a reign of terror upon emancipated Blacks. The Civil War had merely been a Band-Aid applied to a shotgun wound to the head. And as the former Confederates began to take office during reconciliation, Northern and Southern politicians began to make concessions, most often at the expense of Black citizens, most notably the passing of the Jim Crow laws. Laws designed to keep Black Americans as less human than whites and separated. It is during this time that we see most of these statues being erected, monuments to the white supremacy that was never truly defeated. A period of terror ensues, a period where public lynchings of Black people became common, as well as rape and cold-blooded murder. It was also during this time when the lost cause narrative would take off. And for 160 years now, it has kept the Confederacy and its white supremacy alive. The main tenet of this narrative, that the South was fighting for states' rights, not slavery, and that slaves had great working conditions, were loyal to their masters, and had even fought for the Confederacy. It also whitewashed the histories and glorified leaders like Jefferson Davis and Robert E. Lee. So the vast majority of these monuments were erected during this era, an era of pain and heartache, the era of Jim Crow. And it wouldn't be until the 50s, with the ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education, that this era would begin to end and the civil rights movement took shape. But it was after that ruling, as Black people were once again demanding their equality, that Southern states would again begin to erect these monuments and use symbols of white supremacy that look down on Black peoples, pretty much telling them that they should know their place. This is also the time that we would see Southern capitals raising the rebel flag high on their flagpoles. We should not be immortalizing the defenders of white supremacy. And that is what these monuments do exactly. And if governments aren't going to do the moral thing here, it's up to the people. In the second decade of the 21st century, asking Black Americans, or anyone else for that matter, to drive by public property they partly own, occupied by monuments or symbols of men who fought to destroy the country and deny that person's humanity, is perverse. These monuments have been screaming at Black Americans for decades, in some areas as long as 150 years. And what they scream is a lost cause narrative of white supremacy and racial difference. It is not only time to remove these statues, but end the myth of white supremacy. With that, I'll concede the rest of my time.
Thanks so much, Rage. I'm going to kick it back over to Hunter, but did want to mention, as we're going to read Super Chats, when we can, we'll try to read them between segments. And so, Overtly Validated, thanks for your Super Chat, said, I know it's a bit on the nose, but if we should keep Confederate statues, should we also erect statues of former USSR leaders like Gorbachev? I think that might be for CJ Cox. If CJ, we'll give you like a separate little time clip here before your actual opening if you want to respond to that.
All right, definitely. So the question basically was saying we should put up the statues of former communist leaders that have been taken down. Is that correct?
I think so.
All right, well, there's a couple things I would say on that for sure. The first thing is that had I been around in Russia at the time, I would certainly be one, and this may come as somewhat of a surprise, but to actually defend keeping up a statue like Lenin's statue for the exact same reason that I would defend keeping up the statues that we have today, which I'll get a little bit more into, of course, but basically is that we preserve history and understand things from a lens historically that is different than the lens that we would understand things if they were happening in the present. And we see that perfectly with plenty of things like all the Roman monuments and Egyptian monuments and so on and so forth. I don't think there's any need to put up something that's already been torn down. And likewise, when it comes to all the statues that have been taken down already in the former Confederate states, there's no necessity to put them back up. Just like there would be no necessity for me to say, let's build a new one now. What I'm talking about is the statues already being there and addressing it as an issue that's, with the statues being built hundreds of years ago or tens of years ago, whatever it happens to be, not necessarily building or rebuilding new ones. You know what I mean?
Gotcha. Thanks so much. And I'll kick it back over to our dearest guest moderator, Hunter Bailey. By the way, Hunter, can I tell? I mean, I don't want to tell, so I'll let you tell. But, I mean, there's some big news. For those of you who remember Hunter, he has some big news that I am so excited. I just learned about it like 20 minutes ago. So hopefully you're pumped, Hunter, or I should say, hopefully you're equally pumped, everyone listening out there, to hear Hunter's great news. Go ahead, Hunter.
Well, put me on the spot there, but during the whole Corona pandemic thing, I got married. So there's the big news. Yay for me. All right, cool. Now we can move on. Okay, so thanks, James, for that. Put me on the spot. Okay. All right. So, Jay, you got 10 minutes. When you're ready, you can begin.
All righty. Thank you. And thank you for hosting me in this debate. Thank you also to Rage for debating me here today. So I have a few things that I want to address that I think are general rules that we should understand before we actually go into the debate, which are basically the basic foundations of what I'm going to present here forward. I'm not necessarily wording it the right way, but let me just kind of go right into it. So the first thing that we need to understand is that even though we may understand morality as black and white, and regardless of whether philosophically you actually understand morality as absolute, of course, people in their day-to-day lives tend to live as if morality is black and white. And regardless of that, we do tend to understand that human beings themselves are rather gray, that civilization and culture itself is rather gray, that a lot of times things are considered to be acceptable almost universally that today we might be sickened by. And of course, this is something that happens time and time and time again. A big portion of the reason for this is because people, they have cultural beliefs that are passed on from generation to generation. They have ideas that are passed on to them through certain ethnic fights. So, like, for example, the Irish versus the English up in the United Kingdom, right? That's something that went back and forth for long periods of time because of a history of warfare, so on and so forth. The point being that we can see through the lens of history, looking back in the past, that things are actually a lot more complicated than people like to make them out to be. For example, both the modern historian and the lost cause historian would actually make the same mistake into just wrapping everything up, in my opinion, into one word, essentially, or term in the case of the lost cause narrative. In the lost cause narrative, they say it's states' rights. This is partially true. In the narrative of the modern historian, they would say it's strictly slavery. This is also largely true. The fact of the matter is warfare and, once again, people and ideology and culture and things of this nature are incredibly complicated. For example, let's say, hypothetically speaking, there was a lot of talk, whether it was legitimate or not, let's just pretend it was for a minute. There was a lot of talk back in 2012 with people like Alex Jones, the governor of Texas, which I believe was Rick Perry, if I'm not mistaken, and numerous other people in Texas saying, if we ever have to deal with something like Hillary Clinton or people taking our guns and stuff like that, we'd secede. Hypothetically, let's say that happened, right? And 100 years pass, and a politician comes up and says, well, this fight was about gun rights. Is he wrong? No, of course not. That is the straw that broke the camel's back that would eventually lead to the secession, if that had led to a secession. However, if somebody else came across and said it was about preservation of the Bill of Rights, would he be telling a lie? No, because the Second Amendment is actually something that is listed in our 10 amendments of the Constitution. Furthermore, if somebody said, well, an increasing government bureaucracy over hundreds of years eventually just had a lot of Texans disassociated with the United States government, that would also be accurate, right? Even though politically speaking, that's not really going to be on the rhetoric list for most people, but that's the reason a lot of the individuals would be fighting, so on and so forth. And there's numerous other reasons that people could list to say, well, this is why they wanted to fight, this is why they wanted to secede, so on and so forth. That's, of course, a hypothetical, but the same thing is true if we go back to real life looking at the Confederacy. For example, we had 7 states initially seceding from the United States of America. These 7 states obviously were just not having the election of Abraham Lincoln, and that was essentially where they drew the line. And there are 2 things that are simultaneously true here in this situation. The first thing is that what they thought would be taken away from them was what they considered their right to slavery. The second thing is they believed that as individual states, they did not have, the government did not have the authority to actually push that on them. And in fact, a lot of people back then, both North and South, were more associated and had more of a kinship with their state than they actually did with the nation as a whole. It's actually, according to a lot of historians, the Civil War that made Americans, both North and South, really have a solid sense of patriotism and being one nation rather than, these individual split up states. After that had occurred, Abraham Lincoln decides he wants to raise an army because he wants to preserve the Union. And then 4 other states decided to secede. And interestingly enough, one of the states that decided to secede happens to be Virginia. And the Virginia legislature, though it did also list slavery, makes very clear that they thought it was unethical for the president of the United States to actually raise an army against who they considered to be fellow Americans for enacting what they considered to be a sacred human right of secession, which of course is a pretty interesting philosophical question when you consider the fact that the United States of America itself was actually a secessionist movement that broke away from a larger group for reasons that, if we're being completely honest, and I say this as a patriot who loves my country, are relatively trivial, honestly. Like, King George III was not Adolf Hitler by any stretch of the imagination, right? And yet we tend to see these people in a light that actually, justifies their cause and glorifies them and all this other kind of stuff. And of course, I'm not endorsing any sort of hero worship, nor am I saying that George Washington is 100% the moral equivalent of Robert E. Lee. But what I am saying is that when you look at both of these situations, they are very similar in the cases of they are traitors against either the crown or the government of the United States for reasons that are varied and incredibly complicated, that a lot of people thought was incredibly justified, and that in the end, the victors ended up writing the general history on. That doesn't mean that the victors are necessarily wrong. Of course, the Civil War is the reason why the African American is freed in modern America. That's absolutely a fact. That doesn't mean that's the reason it necessarily started. In fact, we all know the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't signed until 1863. That doesn't mean that the people who fought in it individually were people who we would consider to be contemptible. In fact, there's many people who were Confederate generals who you could argue had a more enlightened view of African people than Abraham Lincoln himself. I think one of the best examples is Thomas Stonewall Jackson, who actually went as far as to say that, of course, he and Robert E. Lee even actually endorsed the idea that Black people could fight in the Confederate Army as a way to earn their freedom. But on top of that, Stonewall even would go a little bit farther and would teach them how to read and write for the purposes of reading the Bible. And of course, you can say what you want about the apologetic nature of that. But the point is, as was pointed out by Rage in his opening statement, that was not something that was culturally acceptable. And yet Stonewall Jackson decided that's something that he should do. He thought that it was his Christian duty to teach these people, even though the general culture at the time did not want that to occur. We can say what we want about white man's burden, right? 150 years, knowing that that's an incredibly stupid idea. But at the time, that's a lot more enlightened than what a lot of other people are thinking. For example, things like, oh, well, these are just basically animals and we can treat them however we want, and so on and so forth, right? So understanding it in that context, Robert E. Lee's views on racism are actually significantly more enlightened than a lot of other people, a lot of whom would be fighting for the North. Ulysses S. Grant, of course, owned a slave. And the other big thing we need to understand here is if we start tearing down some historical monuments and some historical figures and their reputations and things like that, we end up tearing down virtually all of them. We've actually seen, it used to be in 2015, 2017, things like that. This was a hypothetical that we were arguing about. Now we have seen, whether it's the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which was an entirely Black regiment of Union soldiers, by the way, their monument was vandalized. The Lincoln Memorial has been consistently vandalized over the years. People call for the taking down of George Washington statues, of Thomas Jefferson statues, of Gandhi statues, for crying out loud, in India, which, to be fair, if we're going to be consistent, Gandhi was an anti-Semite. Gandhi was relatively sexist. Gandhi did have a little bit of a perverted nature about him. And if we decide we're going to start tearing down historical figures, let's just look at things. We know Crazy Horse, for example, was an adulterer. He did not spare prisoners of war. He gave false prophecies, which I'm sure, Rage, as an atheist, that would be something that kind of annoys you, people being essentially religious charlatans. Speaking of religious charlatans, according to Martin Luther King Jr., Martin Luther King Jr. was not a Christian. He did not affirm things like the resurrection and things of that nature, right? So in other words, he used his pulpit for political and social and status reasons, fully understanding that he did not believe the things that he was preaching. He was also a serial adulterer. There are numerous people who have accused him, and I'm not necessarily saying this is or is not the case, but to be fair, the accusations are exactly what people have against Trump. They're exactly what people have against Jefferson and other such figures people want to bring down, none of whom I'm necessarily condemning or endorsing. I'm just painting a picture for you guys. People have accused him of looking upon one of his friends raping somebody else and being a serial sex addict and plagiarizing in his doctoral statement and so on and so forth. Are we going to tear down him now? Are we going to tear down Malcolm X because he was, for a very long period of time, very violent, a racial supremacist, a segregationist, so on and so forth, right? Said things like, and I quote, you're not equal to the white man, you're better than the white man. That's right, I said it, better than the white man, right? Are we going to tear him down now? Are we going to tear down Tecumseh because he was a racist, because he was a religious zealot, because he was an autocrat who did not actually allow any sort of freedom of religion and was incredibly racist actually towards white people in his Prophetstown back in the 1800s, so on and so forth. Julius Caesar, of course, with the conquests, and Lincoln had what many people have termed a concentration camp, and so on and so forth. We can go on and on. Or are we going to understand, looking at these people through a historical lens, that things are relatively complicated and that a lot of people did a lot of things that are relatively admirable while also doing a lot of things that are significantly unadmirable. In the case of Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, they were great generals. They just had great military strategy. People have thought that that was something that was kind of cool. Of course, the rebel spirit is something America. All right. Sorry, I'll just stop there.
Okay, great. So next what we have is the conversation, just an open conversation between you two. And if I have to step in just to separate you two, I will put you in timeout. But we're going to have an open conversation between the two about your opening statements. And again, for people who are watching, if you have a question, go ahead and put it in a super chat and send it with @ModernDayDebate so that we can put you at the front of the list for the questions at the end, so that we can actually get to know people's feedback or the questions you have. Also, in your question, if you can, please add to who the question you want it to be, whether it be to the Raging Atheist, or if you want it to be to Jay Cox, or if you want it to be to both, so that we know who to exactly ask them to. So whenever you guys are ready, Raging Atheist, Jay Cox, it's y'all's floor. Enjoy.
So sorry. One last quick announcement. Thanks for this. Is usually we don't mention this, but I did want to mention so anybody who's new to the channel, the only rule that we have that's like strict, where we bring the hammer down with like 0 warnings, is obviously no hate speech. So if I see something that looks like that, it's like you're not gonna get a warning. And I always, it's actually like, it's probably like maybe 1/10 of a percentage point of people that show up in chat say something. So we're pretty lenient, but I did see one today, and I saw one in the last stream. I know who you guys are. You rear your little heads with your Kermit the Frog profile pictures and stuff like that. Is that we're like pretty easygoing, but when you have hate speeches, like that's the thing we're not going to give you a warning for. If you are harassing somebody, and it's not hate speech. Like, so you're just like, oh, so-and-so is a pervert or whatever, we'll be like, hey, can you lighten up, take it easy, like if you're targeting an individual, like, oh, we'll give you a warning, because we want everybody to enjoy their time in the chat. But like I said, hate speech is the one thing where it's like, no warnings for that one. So thanks, gentlemen. The floor is all yours, as Hunter said.
Awesome. So like there was a lot there in your opening, and I want to try to get to all of it, but it seemed like the main gist of your argument here is, we're not tearing down statues of Stalin, or where is it going to stop? Are we going to tear down statues of Washington, Stalin, all of these other people? And we're not talking about those. For say a person like George Washington, we make monuments to him despite his sin, not based upon it. So we believe in the power of memorials to say something about who we are. We have memorials to 9/11, as we should, but we would be horrified if someone were to put up a memorial to Osama bin Laden for what he did in 9/11. arguably the most influential person of the 20th century is Hitler, and yet the world would be rightfully outraged if they were erecting statues of Hitler in Berlin. We're talking about the enslavement of human beings and constant reminders that those freed slaves now, their descendants have to look at every single day. That's the issue of the topic here. It's not other statues. It's not where do we go beyond that. It's the Confederacy statues. Now, these Confederates were traitors to the nation. You mentioned secession. Secession was ruled unconstitutional by the United States Supreme Court. And while I agree it's a good philosophical argument to argue about that in reference to the revolution, the Supreme Court did rule on it. And it seems to me that it's not really a good argument because we're not even really talking about the succession. We're talking about the people that fought to maintain the white supremacy of the South and to continue owning and brutalizing human beings.
Well, I think there's a few things to be commented on upon that. I think the first thing is we need to understand not only where these sorts of things lead, but also the hypocrisy in some of these things, which is part of the reason I mentioned other historical figures. Quite frankly, I think you could make a serious argument that Stonewall Jackson had a more enlightened view of race than Malcolm X. And Malcolm X I'm not advocating, by the way, that we start tearing down anything from Malcolm X either. What I'm saying, though, is that people need to be understood within their historical context. For example, in the case of Virginia as a whole, right? So not even just Stonewall and Robert E. Lee and James Longstreet, who was in the Army of Northern Virginia and so on and so forth, but just the state of Virginia as a whole. Their primary concern upon actually deciding we're going to secede was not actually anything that had to do with slavery or even government overreach. It wasn't even necessarily states' rights. What they were actually upset about was the idea that Lincoln was going to raise up an army and invade what they considered to be their fellow countrymen. And of course, like I said, most people back at that time, North or South, it really doesn't matter. They were very tribalistic in the sense that it was really your state that you identified with. It really wasn't the nation. You identified being somebody from Ohio, somebody from Virginia, so on and so forth, right? Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee were doing basically what we would expect of any good soldier in fighting for what they considered to be their home without any sort of political bias one way or another. Their home itself was seceding because they felt that the use of violent force to keep the nation together was not justified, which is, of course, an argument in and of itself. And I think with those things being in context, you start to see that this is not the black and white issue that people make it out to be, lost cause or modern. And I agree with you that the lost cause narrative is false, but there is some truth to it in the sense that not all of these people were evil or just wanting to, go about oppressing black people and stuff like that, right? A lot of times it was, like I said, in the case of Thomas Jackson, wanting to defend what he considered to be his homeland from an invader. I mean, we would consider that to be pretty admirable in most people, right?
Well, sure. But there's a huge difference between Stonewall Jackson and Malcolm X. Malcolm X didn't own human beings, right?
Be that as it may, though, Malcolm X was quite hateful. I mean, right? I mean,
sure. Like in his earlier days, sure, but he didn't own human beings. So that's a huge difference there. Also, you are giving a lost cause narrative here. You're saying like, Virginia, for instance, wanted to didn't think that it was constitutional for Lincoln to raise an army, although Lincoln did have that power. He had those war powers just like the modern presidents do. But yet the moment they seceded from the Union, they were no longer part of the Union. So that argument is moot. And when it comes to Virginia, Virginia had the most slaves in the Union. And in their Declaration of Succession, the primary reason was slavery. It wasn't the other thing. It was slavery.
Well, the legislature actually said when they voted to secede that their primary reason for seceding, it was April 11th, I believe, of 1861. They said that they did not believe it was justified for Lincoln to raise that army. Now, of course, like I said, we can argue about whether or not it is justified.
I mean, of course, one thing I would say that when they have the most slaves.
Well, I mean, that's honestly kind of irrelevant when you consider the historical situation. I mean, let's think about this. Maryland had a bunch of slaves. West Virginia had a bunch of slaves. Missouri had a bunch of slaves. Kentucky had a bunch of slaves. These are in the Union.
Well,
so, I mean, that's
the issue wasn't
irrelevant.
even the southern states. Lincoln wasn't trying to take the southern states' right to slavery. He was trying to stop slavery from advancing into the western territories. That was the issue. That was why the South succeeded, because they thought, well, if Lincoln's going to do it over there, he's going to do it over here. So they became traitors to the country.
Right, but I mean, being a traitor is, I mean, that's a term that is honestly very loaded depending on what side you're on. George Washington is a traitor, right? I mean, that's a matter of historical fact. Well, I mean, in fact, he was even a member of the British Army, right?
So those are two different things. The Revolution was about taxation without representation, not the owning of human beings. And those founding fathers, quite a few of them actually wrestled with the moral dilemma of slavery. Thomas Jefferson being one of them when he wrote his Declaration of Independence. So this was always a moral issue. You talk about looking back with the modern lens, with our modern lens, and that's really the only way we can do it. That pretty much the entire world has come to the moral conclusion that slavery was wrong. But even back then, you had great pioneers looking through a moral lens and seeing slavery to be wrong.
And to be fair, I mean, you should look at some of the writings of a lot of these Confederate leaders. Some of it were those Confederate leaders. Like I said, I pointed out that Stonewall Jackson went against what everybody said about what African Americans were, or I guess at that time they wouldn't really be considered African Americans.
Well, sure, but then he fought to defend white supremacy.
He fought to defend Virginia. There's a very fundamental difference. And this is the thing this is the problem with looking back at history through a modern lens, right? Stonewall Jackson was not interested in, and to be fair, the majority of soldiers, I think this can be stated as a rule, were not interested in the preservation of the institution of white supremacy or even of slavery. The vast majority of soldiers didn't have enough money to buy a slave. In fact, we could argue that they may have become slaves 20, 30 years in the future had the Confederacy won. That's obviously a point of debate. But there was certainly people like the vice president of the Confederacy, for example, who had suggested as much, right? They were fighting because of what they perceived as, and you can say that you don't believe in it or do believe in it. What they perceived as an invasion on their homeland where they grew up, right? And obviously, it turns out that their homeland was doing some relatively evil things. That's perfectly fair. But a lot of people's homelands were doing evil things, and yet the soldiers themselves were sitting there defending their homeland. They weren't defending the politicians. And in fact, I would say it's a relatively elitist narrative, in my opinion. And I'm not saying you're an elitist. I just want to make myself clear. But it's a relatively elitist narrative to pin the politicians' rhetoric and, quite frankly, stupidity on the individual soldier and citizen. And by the way, because I know this is going to come up, I extend that to the Germans in Nazi Germany. Okay, the people of Germany need to be understood as human beings, even if what their government did was wrong. That doesn't mean we need to defend somebody like Adolf Hitler, right? But it does mean that we need to understand that these things are a lot more complicated than people think.
I agree with that. I totally 100% agree with that. That doesn't give any justification to keep up monuments to these people. And yeah, they could have been good people, but they also owned slaves. And I don't care, this is part of the lost cause narrative. So I didn't look at Stonewall Jackson too much. And from what I did see, he did seem to be a relatively good slave master. But when it comes to Robert E. Lee, his slaves are quoted to saying he was one of the worst men in the history of the world. And part of that lost cause narrative is glorifying this man to be something he's not. For one, you mentioned that he was like some kind of military genius. Many historians believe that his decision to fight a conventional war against a much more superior army, Lincoln's army, was a huge, major strategical blunder. But beyond that, there's one quote, a letter that he wrote to the New York Times that gets misquoted. People love to say, oh, Robert E. Lee was so enlightened because he said that slavery is a moral and political evil. They don't go on to finish the quote. The rest of the quote is, I think it, however, a greater evil to the white man than to the black race. And while my feelings are strongly enlisted for the latter, my sympathies are more strong for the former. The blacks are immeasurably better off here than in Africa, morally, socially, and physically. The painful discipline they are undergoing, if necessary, for their instruction as a race, and I hope will prepare and lead them to better things. How long their subjugation may be necessary is known and ordered by a wise, merciful providence. Their emancipation will sooner result from the mild and melting influence of Christianity than the storms and tempests of fiery controversy. He thought he had a God-given right to his slaves. So to whitewash the history of Robert E. Lee as being some moral arbiter is just false.
Well, hang on. There's a couple things there, I think. So first and foremost, I would say, and I know it's not the point of the argument, but I mean, I would debate with anybody who wants to say that Robert E. Lee wasn't a military genius. He made mistakes, certainly. I mean, some of the largest mistakes we've ever seen were done by some of the greatest.
He invaded
like
the North
Napoleon
twice
Bonaparte,
and
for
lost
example.
both of those incursions. It was a huge blunder.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But then there was, I mean, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Bull Run, the second.
No doubt. He won individual battles, oftentimes against overwhelming odds.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Overall,
as a
that's
what I'm saying. He was a fantastic. But and that's
if he'd
fine.
have fought a more guerrilla war, he would have probably had a better chance of winning.
That's fair. That's and in fact, to be fair, General James Longstreet said as much, and Stonewall Jackson himself was fond of using his smaller army in ways that were not necessarily conventional. So I agree with you on that, but that doesn't mean that the man, right, we should give credit where, and this is a big problem that I actually have with this idea. See, the problem with tearing down statues isn't even in the act of tearing down statues, but in what it ends up representing in tearing down the people themselves completely. Like, we can't even acknowledge that Robert E. Lee did some very brilliant things. I mean, the man whooped virtually every Union general, including, by the way, Ulysses Grant, who beat him. The difference with Grant was a pit bull and he refused to lose.
Right? I think that's natural. Like what's his name? The roof guy that went and shot 9 people in the black church. He probably did some good things in his life, right? But we're not going to glorify him because what he did was reprehensible. It's the same.
That's fundamentally different, though. That's fundamentally different, though.
No, it's not. Like a lot of these slave masters did a lot worse than that.
For numerous reasons, though. So first off, like I said, we do need to understand things in their historical and cultural context. What Robert E. Lee believed, and you'll notice I did say earlier on that what Robert E. Lee believed was what's called white man's burden. The idea of white man's burden was that it was actually a burden on the white man to actually own the slave for the slave's own social and moral and religious growth, I guess you could say, right? It's an abhorrent idea, absolutely. That's what Robert E. Lee believed. However, how much more enlightened is that than Nathan Bedford Forrest, who thinks that these people are literally, I mean, essentially just animals, right? Who wants to go out and torch them, who slaughters prisoners of war simply because he's infuriated that white and black people in the South,
that was American
by the way.
policy. They were 3/5 a human. They weren't even considered fully human.
Well, I understand that, but once again, that's the politicians, right?
No,
Robert E. Lee had his own, and by the way,
the law of the land.
That's perfectly fair, but doesn't that kind of prove my point in the sense that this is something that you look at what Robert E. Lee is actually believing, and it's not enlightened by our standards by any stretch. Granted, by his standards, comparing that to Nathan Bedford Forrest, comparing that to some of the other slave masters, to the fire eaters as they were called, right? That's absolutely enlightened. It's not Thomas Jackson enlightened. It's not Marcellus Clay enlightened, right? But it's enlightened for the time period.
I will grant that it was enlightened for the time period, but still he fought to keep black people slaves and free black people were living in these areas having to stare at a statue of this man. We can take these statues down. Nobody's saying whitewash history. Nobody's saying, in fact, this is actually trying to stop the whitewashing and the glorifying of these Confederates and put them back in their actual place. These things belong in a museum, a place that you can go and context can be provided to this, but we have to put ourselves in the shoes of our fellow citizens right now, people whose grandparents were slaves, right? And they have to look at these statues. And it's easy for us to sit here and talk, semantics and history, but we need to put ourselves in their shoes, what they have to go through on a daily basis when they look at the people that didn't even consider them to be human.
See, but and the thing about that, though, is there's 2 different ways that you can put yourself in their shoes. And I want to address that in a second because I just want to briefly say, as it pertains to these statues, I will say that I admire the fact that you separate the 2 because very few people do. However, I think the movement itself doesn't separate the acts that one did and the statues that somebody has with their reputation as a whole. And to an extent, we even see people, my problem with the modern historian, and again, I want to be clear, Lost Cause and the modern narrative as sold in your universities, I think they are both flawed with a lot of truth in them, right? To be fair, the modern one more so than the Lost Cause. I would grant that accuracy as well.
The Lost Cause is basically propaganda.
It certainly is some propaganda, absolutely. But there's points of it that, like, for example, you were talking about the whole Virginia thing. That is a Lost Cause narrative because the Lost Cause would preserve that historical fact. But it is a historical fact. And these people believe Robert E. Lee, and this is one of the things I keep wanting to point out. He fought. If you asked Robert E. Lee, why are you fighting? It was, I want to defend Virginia. In fact, he said as much.
Well, yeah, he said that to Lincoln. I think I'm quite aware of that.
Yeah,
I didn't
right. So being offered the army there. So that is something that is fundamentally different from what someone like Jefferson Davis or what someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the KKK, right? What they might believe. And what I'm saying is what we did in not only reconciliation with Abraham Lincoln's idea of reconciliation, but also with, kind of allowing, the Confederates to basically live on, was we set up a system which in the future has done us very well, by the way, of treating historical radicals in an understandable way, because we know what it's like. That's why we were here in the first place. And that's why a lot of Native Americans, a lot of times farther on, it depends on the place, obviously, sometimes they were absolutely brutalized. A lot of other times they went on to go get, educated, and then obviously would they be happy with their situation? No. But for the time, there was people who wanted to be enlightened and wanted to push forward certain things that would actually, help people out and things like that. And we see that looking back through history, right? We see that there are people who wanted to do these things, people who actually did great things, people who did great things despite doing other terrible things. One of the ways that you can actually see where other people are coming from is by understanding that they have a lot of heroes who did the same. That by understanding that Malcolm X was a very racist man, by understanding that Martin Luther King had numerous terrible qualities, by understanding that Nat Turner wanted to literally go into white homes and kill white women and children, right? And understanding that despite those things, despite those abhorrent beliefs and actions, right, that there was a historical context to understand it in.
Nat Turner led a slave revolt and he killed white people, but they were brutalizing him and his people. Like you don't understand that's justified. All right. So that's the second time now you brought up Native Americans. Now I need to inform you, I am 33% Cherokee. You first mentioned Crazy Horse and how he was a false prophet. For one, he wasn't a Christian, that he was an adulterer. Native Americans had very different lifestyles, and he took no prisoners of war. The European committed a genocide upon his people, and you're going to say he needs to fight by the Geneva Convention? No, that's not how it works. That's not accurate history. And then you're going to gloss over the whites pretty much kidnapping Native American children, forcing them into Christian boarding schools, and talk about like that's some kind of good thing. It wasn't. It's part of the genocide. It's part of these pain of American.
There's multiple things that need to be pointed out there. First and foremost, right? We need to understand that what the American people were doing in that war. And by the way, let me just be perfectly frank. You're not going to find a very much more pro-Native American conservative than I. In fact, I'm a believer of nationalism and for all nations. I would like to see a form of Zionism for Native Americans. I'm 100% positive that would improve relations between our peoples, especially if it wasn't forced. Like if there was this thing like, hey, you can go have a country, but also you can stay here if you'd like to as well. I mean, that would be amazing. So I think that could actually do us a lot of good. And there's a lot of areas in this country that are very sparsely populated. That being said, it's not like the Native Americans weren't actually just as brutal in warfare as we were. There was no Geneva Convention, right? There obviously things are exaggerated, of course, but there was instances of Native Americans slaughtering villages filled with women and children. There was obviously tribes that scalped people. There was obviously raping and pillaging and plundering and all that kind of stuff, right? My point in bringing Crazy Horse up in slaughtering these people, right, is not to tarnish Crazy Horse. It's to say you guys need to understand, and I say you guys generally, not you in particular, obviously, that things have a very specific historical context. You even pointed it out there. Well, his people were being attacked. Exactly. So he feels he's justified in doing something that a lot of us would feel is not justified. You actually brought up Osama bin Laden. I'm glad that you did, because I know people who will justify Osama bin Laden tooth and nail, and they're wrong, in my opinion, of course, and I think objectively, but that's a philosophical question, but they're very understandable. They're very understandable. I understand exactly why they hate the United States of America. I just think that it's wrong to fly planes into buildings. And if somebody were to build a statue of Osama bin Laden, and 100 years down the road, a more enlightened democratic group took over Saudi Arabia and wanted to take it down, I would honestly say keep it up, understand the history of what this person represented, why he represented it, and that we're all human beings. Because, one of the problems we have here, and this is why I have a problem with taking down these statues, is they breed mentalities that completely label not only historical figures as evil and to be thrown out and things like that, but also modern groups that are alleged to be their descendants. For example, the Republican Party, which has no link whatsoever to the Confederacy, and yet a lot of people think that they are. Now, I'm not saying whether you're Republican, Democrat, not the point. The point is that they were not allowed in the Democratic or in the Confederacy. They were not dominant in the South until 100 years after the Confederacy was destroyed. And yet we link them. And because of that link, now we need to tear them down as well. Because of the link of George Washington being a slave owner, we need to tear him down as well. It breeds a mentality. Whereas if we just say, I want to preserve the history, understanding what happened. And by the way, this is not just my opinion. It's the opinion of many Black conservatives also. So if we want to play the understanding other people, there's other people who are of other cultures and other races who agree with me on the issue, like David Webb, Anthony Bryan Logan. I'm sure Candace Owens does, but I can't actually say that for
she's
fact.
a grifter. All right. So there was a lot there, and I think I forgot most of it.
Sorry, I'm a little long-winded sometimes.
Yeah. Shit. Yeah. My daughter totally got me off track here. Will you just kind of repeat the gist of your argument that you just made?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's that I think that number one way to understand people is to understand their historical figures are complicated also. Number two, we need to understand things as historians differently from the way that and I didn't actually word this properly, but differently from the way we would understand it at the time. Crazy Horse did have reasons that he felt made him justified in slaughtering these soldiers, but maybe we would disagree looking back. If it were to happen today, maybe we would disagree. And then I brought up Osama bin Laden and understanding why Osama bin Laden did what he did, having people who have explained to me why and understanding where they come from, right? And doing that, by the way, without actually justifying him, right? There's a famous quote from Alan Moore's Watchmen, without condoning or condemning, right? I think we as thinkers, historical, philosophical, all that kind of stuff, we need to understand that a lot of times. And then I said that it breeds a mentality that tears down history as a whole, and indeed even groups that are considered to be associated with that history, whether falsely or rightly. Like, for example, people saying the Republican Party is linked to the Confederacy.
Right. That's what I wanted to hear. Cool.
Historical inaccuracy.
All right, so sorry about that. My daughter usually knows better to interrupt me during the debate, but it is 9:00. It's her nighttime shot, so she had reason. So I apologize for that. So when it comes to history and nuances of history, nobody's saying we need to erase the history here. In fact, I think most proponents of taking down these statues are more for actually telling the real history, having all of the nuance, showing the truth of it, showing the brutality, and that can't be forgotten when it comes to talking about these statues. These are bringing terrifying memories of what happened to family members in the not so distant past to Black Americans in this country. But you mentioned Republicans and Democrats and how Republicans can't be linked to the Confederacy, and you are just wrong there. So what happened in the Civil Rights Movement is the party switched. Pretty much everybody knows this. During the Civil Rights Movement, the Dixiecrats became Southern Republicans. You're right. It was 100 years later when the Republicans switched. But you're talking like the Republicans back in 1860 were the liberals and the Democrats were the conservatives. The parties flipped. So that's how the Republican Party today, who claim to be the party of Lincoln when they're not, is linked to the Confederacy. And that's why a vast majority of so-called Confederates today call themselves Republicans.
I would like to actually offer a debate offer for that in the future, because to be honest with you, I could completely divert the topic getting into that. I think that's a very interesting point. But to make a long story short, I think that the narrative of the Southern strategy is significantly overblown.
Like the Republican Party admitted to it.
Well, hang on. There's a whole bunch of things that need to be understood with that. First and foremost, there's a lot of figures who, for example, George Wallace, the most famous, right, of those hardcore states' rights, segregationists, all that kind of stuff. He died in, I think, the 90s, a Democrat, the lifelong Democrat. And the Democrats have always believed generally the same stuff they do now. The political ideology, of course, shifts over the course of 100 years. But this idea that, like, for example, it was the quote unquote progressives led by people like William Jennings Bryan, a Democrat, in the early 1900s who wanted to go after big corporations and stuff like that, breaking up monopolies. And it just so happened that Theodore Roosevelt was this kind of lightning rod precisely because he was a progressive yet a Republican, right? That's 100 years ago, 50 years before the quote unquote switch. Strom Thurmond is the example most people use, but Strom Thurmond is one dude. You're right. He's one guy.
It was more than just one guy. It was all of the Southern Dixiecrats. I mean, this is known history. This is something that conservatives try to run from because they try to continue to maintain that they're still the party of Lincoln. And again, mind you, Lincoln didn't want to end slavery, so it's not like you're the party that wanted to end slavery, But again, it's just not accurate. They are no longer that party. When it comes to this issue, when it comes to civil rights and equality, the party switched.
I mean, I simply don't think there's any evidence for that. And I say that, by the way, as somebody who is not a Republican, even though I am a conservative. I have numerous problems with the party. That is
I'm not a Democrat anymore after all the recent bullshit.
I'm glad we can agree on that at least, because that is more people figure that out, the better this country will be, in my personal opinion. But moving on, just because I don't want to get this too diverted. Like I said, we should definitely meet up and talk about this.
I would definitely have another debate on that topic with you at another time.
Absolutely. But to get more kind of like back to the point, when you say, nobody is saying completely tarnish these historical figures totally and things like that. The thing is they are. The thing is a lot of people are actually saying that same way. In fact, there's people
from Black Americans that don't want to deal with it. But like when it comes to taking down the statues, it's not about whitewashing history. It's just about getting them off of the public space. Most, and yes, there is some extremist here, but most of us would like to see a U.S. slavery museum where all of these artifacts and the context surrounding them can be put, and then Americans can go and truly learn the history of the Civil War instead of the whitewashed history that people are learning today.
But both are a whitewashed version, though. I mean, you said even yourself, right, when we were having earlier in this conversation, this idea that, well, yeah, but Robert E. Lee made these huge blunders. I know he did, but numerous people did. And when you study the military history, I mean, there are some guys, right?
Nobody's perfect.
Perfect example, because I love this example. Ulysses S. Grant, because he's the one who fought and eventually defeated Lee. Ulysses S. Grant was criticized relentlessly by Union newspapers because his strategy was essentially what a lot of people called meat grinder strategy, which was just, I have more troops and they are better equipped and I'm going to pound you into the ground. It worked, but his casualty rate was something like 2, sometimes 3, sometimes 4 to 1 against Lee, who decided to actually, do things, even though conventionally a little bit more. Now, that the point not to necessarily get off on Lee himself, but to say that is a narrative now modern historians want to push to tarnish the man's military accomplishments because they don't agree with the fact that he fought for what he perceives to be his country, i.e. Virginia, hence the reason why the Confederacy was set up as a confederacy rather than a federation.
I would agree that we shouldn't
try to tarnish that in the modern narrative. They're both pretty, biased, both Lost Cause and the modern narrative.
I would agree that we shouldn't take away, what Robert E. Lee did, what the Confederates did, the battle. We should learn from that lesson, and you can only learn from history if it's there and if it's accurate. So I would totally agree with that, and that's not what taking the statues down is for. Taking the statues down, again, is for every person, not just Black people. You can be a white person, you can be a person of any color, pass that statue and understand fundamentally the social ramifications that's having on people today. Today, those statues are glaring down at human beings and saying, you need to be put in your place. And they were erected at specific times in history when Black people were either being subjugated or trying to find their equality. And they were deliberately erected to put those Black people back in their place. You cannot run away from that. The lost cause narrative has been very poisonous to this country. And I will agree that we need to have a full and accurate history. We do not need to forget this history. Every person should know this history. And sadly, too many people don't. It's not about that. It's about taking them off of the public space, putting them in a museum where they belong, and respecting our fellow human beings around us.
Honestly, if I trusted the modern establishment, which I use sort of generally because in America, the establishment is interchangeable. Different people can be elected at different times. Different people can be professors at different times. Understanding that, though, the modern established train of thought, I think, if I could trust them to actually preserve history in a way that would be accurate, I would have no problem with that. The problem is they don't.
it would be much more accurate than monuments glorifying these people when you yourself said it's very nuanced. They were human beings. They were very flawed, not to mention slave owners. We should not be glorifying the defenders of white supremacy. This white supremacy narrative has resurfaced several times. I think I saw like 3 key point times since the Civil War. And it's resurfacing now as we speak. Well before people took to the streets with this current protest. We've seen a spike in white nationalist groups and neo-Nazi groups since Trump took office. We've seen a spike in racist hate crimes since Trump took office. We are seeing a spike in white supremacy again because we never got rid of it. And it's a false doctrine. It's a doctrine we invented to justify to our Christian selves that it was okay to own and brutalize human beings when it wasn't. And we need to defeat that false narrative.
And I do agree that the lost cause is a false narrative, but I also think, I mean, you say
I'm talking about the white supremacy. The lost cause is only 160 years old. The white supremacy in this country is 400 years old.
See, that's not even possible, though, because this country is not even 400 years old. And that's another thing.
It was however old it is. I think it's like the 1700s when the country was discovered. The 1700s when the mid-Atlantic trade slave was established. So, I mean, it's been nearly 400 years if it hasn't been quite 400 years yet.
Yeah, but there's multiple things that need to be said there. I mean, first and foremost, the United States was not a country until 1789.
Maybe everything before 1789 maybe I'm getting my numbers wrong.
Cannot be blamed on the United States, right? That's when our Constitution was established.
Well, no, but even before that, that white supremacy was here because we owned slaves before that Constitution was established.
That has nothing to do with the United States. That would be,
it does.
That would be
it's the entire reason that Thomas Jefferson wasn't
era.
able to get it eradicated. It's the reason the Southern states and that Continental Congress didn't want to lose their slaves. It was an issue in that Continental Congress because it was already an issue before. You can't take that away.
I get that, but it has nothing to do with the United States in the sense that our history of being racist as a country cannot possibly be older than our history as a country. We began in 1789. 1776 is a historical misnomer. In fact, July 4th wasn't even the day the Declaration of Independence was signed. You know what I mean? So. But like the fact is, it was 1789, 19 years. I am older than 19. I think everybody here is. I'm only 22, but I am older than 19, right? 19 years it took for the United States of America to say, you know what, this whole mid-Atlantic slave trade thing, I'm not really down with. 76 years it took. That is lower than the average age, the average life expectancy in the United States for us to abolish slavery. 76 years. That's
they
it,
ended the
right?
mid-Atlantic
I know people
trade.
older than that.
They ended the trade, but not the slavery, not the antebellum slavery itself. And,
right.
and you cannot take away the fact
1789 to 1808, right? That's 19 years. And then 1789 to 1865, that's 76 years.
You cannot take away the fact that there was years before that, years upon years of slavery and white supremacy that had ingrained itself into this nation. In fact, our policing system, we have kept from England, like sheriffs. We still have sheriffs to this day. And the policing system is what's at issue right now. So, I mean, you can't take away from the fact that the history before the country, sure, yeah, the country 19 years later abolished the slave trade. They didn't abolish slavery. And that white supremacy was there ingrained in our society well before that. And that is my point.
One thing
I mean, there's a lot of things that were ingrained in a society well before that, though, but they're not something that you can actually blame on the United States. The 400 years narrative.
Hey, Jay, hold on 1 second. We got James talking real quick. James, go ahead.
Hold on. Let me, I think I have to unmute myself on Zoom.
Oh, no, you're unmuted. We can hear you.
Hopefully you can hear me. So basically what we will do is in a second, maybe just a couple more minutes, we will go into the Q&A. And so if you have any questions, folks, fire them into the old live chat. If you tag me with @ModernDayDebate, we'll grab those questions and be sure they at least get in the list, and we'll go through as many as we possibly can with the remaining time we have, which is, so I'll say maybe if one of you is willing to defer to the other and giving them the last word, excellent. Otherwise, in 2 minutes, strictly in 2 minutes, I will quickly bring us into Q&A. So going back to you, CJ.
I just wanted to briefly say the 400-year narrative, it assumes American guilt for the crimes of nations that were around before America even existed. It would be roughly equivalent of blaming groups like, for example, the Iraqis for the fact that the Rashidun Caliphate committed slaughters of Christians and other people who were native to the area that we now know as Iraq, when in reality, they're separated. They're not the same people. They're not even the same nation. You know what I mean? So I think we just need to understand that, like, when it comes to those narratives, the United States itself had slavery for a lower amount of time than you as an American are expected to live. And that is a absolutely fantastic achievement when you consider, rightfully so, as you've said, how racist and supremacist a lot of groups around the world actually were at that time. But go ahead.
My final word is that's only true because we fought a war and we defeated those. We defeated the South. And, you know, again, I'm not talking about. I'm not using a 400-year narrative as, oh, we're owning their sins too. I'm simply saying it provided the white supremacy in our society, and it was there before our society was even formed. That's my point. And when it comes to the statues, I'm here talking about the sins of the Confederacy. I'm only talking about, so when you talk about that, you have to talk about the root cause, which is that white supremacy, which is that 3/5 narrative. And you can't escape that. So that's what these statues are about. And even New Orleans, who pulled down all of their monuments, want to put those monuments into a museum. That is the talk. That is what we're talking. We're not saying erase history. We're saying respect our fellow human beings.
We're